So let's just briefly review. I started this series at the Kalamazoo Library. I checked, and it was like the beginning of 2018. So it'll be 2 years, probably in January or February, somewhere around in that area. And if you remember that this presentation is divided into 3 or 4 parts, or 3 or 4 sessions. And so the first one we did, and they were 3 weeks, 3 times, when we went from the First Peoples to the beginnings of the Republican Party in 1854. And then the second session we did, which was also 3 times, we looked at, as you see here, the Civil War. We looked at the economy, concentrating on those 4 aspects of our economy, and looked at people coming here from other countries and other areas of the United States, looked at cities, and then also looked at the area of progressivism as far as what was going on politically and socially in Michigan. So that brought us up to where we were in May, and in May, where we were is we started looking at the automobile industry. We spent our time looking at 4 different overall topics. One was the reasons for the auto industry centering in Michigan, keeping in mind that the elements that we looked at could have been found in a lot of other states. They were just all in Michigan too. So the reasons included such things as access to raw materials, access to water and railroads, looking at transportation, finding some skilled labor, because a lot of these individuals had worked in machine shops. So they were either skilled or semi-skilled. We looked at the idea of Detroit was known as an open shop, meaning that it wasn't highly unionized, which appealed to a lot of the companies and individuals that were going to center there. And another thing was that there was a great amount of investment capital, people who had made their fortunes in lumbering and mining, and they were looking for the next big thing to invest their money in. During that presentation, we looked at some of the individuals involved. Not everybody, but some of the big ones, like Henry Ford and Henry Leland and David Buick and Louis Chevrolet, just to see if there were any common elements with them, what were their lives like before they got involved with the automobile industry. One of the not overriding characteristics of all of them, but at least a great majority of them, is they did have some background in machinery. Either their fathers had been machinists, or they had been involved in related industries like rifles or plumbing or interchangeable parts, that type of thing. Railroads, one of them was involved with the railroads, which always helped them in looking at this industry. I always like to focus on 3 of what I think are the most prominent ones. The first gentleman we looked at was Ransom Olds, who was one of the first. He probably had the first real auto factory in Michigan, and that was around 1897, located in Lansing, and then eventually he relocated to Detroit. A couple other things that Ransom is known for, we talked about name recognition, where he called his car the Oldsmobile, which resembled the word automobile. Mass marketing. He experimented, when you look at an engine, with steam. He experimented with electric, and then decided on gasoline. That's where he wanted to put his focus. And also one of the things was factory authorized service. Henry Ford, we spent a little time with at our last presentation. The focus that Henry Ford had was to build an inexpensive, reliable car, and he finally found it after a lot of attempts in creating the Model T in 1908. He had started his company in the third attempt with him, because there were 2 other previous attempts. The Ford Motor Company started in 1903, and it took him 5 years to come to that car, the Model T. Ford is known for production, mass production. He added movement to the assembly line, the concept of vertical integration, where you know every aspect of that industry from start to finish, Ford was involved with. The idea of interchangeable parts. He didn't invent a lot of those, but he combined them all together. He also went into adopting the theory of scientific management. But as we found with the automation that Ford had in his auto industry, making the Model T, you had a problem, and that was high turnover. And where we ended last time was looking at Ford's introduction of the $5 day and the impact that had specifically on turnover, because he had a very high rate of turnover of workers because of the sheer boredom and just the constant doing the same thing over and over again led to that turnover. The $5 day did help. And other reasons included unionism, stopping unions, and also having some sort of influence over the behavior of his employees. So where we ended last time was Ford had taken control of the company. And there are just a few more things I want to talk about with Mr. Ford before we go on to our third individual, who we are going to emphasize a little bit more this evening. About 2 years before he took control of the company, which was in 1919, in 1917, he moved production. Now, previously, they were located in Highland Park. Previous to that, they were located in the city of Detroit. But by 1917, he decided to shift his major production to the Rouge plant, which is where Ford is located now, not far from Dearborn. He was aided because at this point in time, World War I was going on, and so the federal government helped him in putting what he needed to, whether it was dredging the river, the Rouge River, and making that better. But it did, as it said here, it did eventually become the world's largest complex. He had everything, and eventually they had it timed as far as how much time it would take for raw material to come to the plant and the finished product to leave. He had a glass making, they had a steel processing, it was a lot. And we can see here that by 1920, everything was shifted over in that direction. When you look at all the different automobile, the whole total automobile industry and the impact that it had on Detroit itself, you can really see it when you look at the population and the growth of the population. 1900, and the population was growing anyway because of the number of industries in Detroit, but it certainly even ballooned even more because of this. But when you look at the difference between 1900 as opposed to 1920, that's quite a jump. I don't think that there was any city that grew as quickly as Detroit did. And when you become number 4 in the United States, you're also going to be dealing with challenges that you're going to have to provide housing and provide services to the people who are coming to the area. And that's a lot with the auto industry. With Ford and employment, the $5 day was one thing. But when you look at how his numbers grew, we're going to look between 1904, so a 16-year time period. What was the difference as far as the numbers of people that were working for Henry Ford? 1904, he had 31 employees. By 1920, he had 56,000 employees. It was 40% of the city's workforce were working at the Ford Motor Company. His Americanization program has been widely written about. I don't want to say that they encouraged. I think it was required because a number of these people who were working at the plant came from other countries and came to Detroit because of what they had heard in the newspapers and heard from people about what was going on in the United States. And so it was required, not suggested, but definitely required that you become an American citizen. And Ford had a very strong program. By 1916, he had 62 different nationalities. And so what he had them go through were 72 lessons where they learned language, they learned social skills, they were able to become a citizen. And I always think it was so interesting that when you hear the term melting pot, again, I'm not saying that Henry Ford created the melting pot, but there are photographs that show the ceremonies that he had these employees go through, where they would come in, they would march in wearing their costume from their country of origin. And when it was time, they would actually walk through this very large pot. And how they did it, I don't know, because when they exited, they were wearing a shirt and tie and slacks and a straw hat. So the clothes from their country were gone, and they were dressed as what would be pictured as typical American citizens. So this was something that was very important to him. With African American workers, Ford had one of the largest percentage of African Americans that worked for him. It said that he put them at all levels, but I think the majority of them were probably in the foundries, hired as janitors. They worked as foremen, in some cases supervisors. He hired African Americans in larger numbers than any other United States industrial firm. The reason why? Well, there's speculation that what he wanted was a sense of loyalty from the workers, especially, again, if there was more push to unionize the workers. And we will see, probably not tonight, but at another session, whether or not that helped. When the Ford Motor Company moved to the Rouge plant, the majority of the workers lived in Dearborn. Dearborn was a very segregated city, and there was really no room for the African American workers to live there, so a number of them lived in Inkster. And in a lot of biographies about Henry Ford, they talk about the things that he did to support the workers in Inkster, as far as what he did as far as supporting cultural life and other things there, because that's where they had to work, or where they had to live. And as far as unionization, there were efforts, but there was really anything successful. One of the things with Ford that you do hear more and more of, and in fact you really heard a lot about it at the beginning of this year, is Ford and anti-Semitism. There have been books that have been written about it. There have been a lot of articles written about him. There's been speculation as far as how did Ford become known as an anti-Semite. It was a well-known fact. I don't think it really surprised anybody. There was speculation that, he may have been influenced by the books he read when he was younger. He may have also been influenced by things that he heard as he was growing up, or assumptions that he made. No matter what the reason was that he became this way, there were things that he did, especially, well, I should say a thing that he did 100 years ago that really brought it to light. And in December of 1918, he decided to buy a newspaper in Dearborn. It was called the Dearborn Independent. It was one of the 4 newspapers in Dearborn. It was a smaller newspaper. And the first issue was published in January of 1919, so over 100 years ago. And what Ford did is he had an editor and a writer that he would convey his opinions, and then they would then put it in the newspaper. His opinions really came to light about a year later, after the newspaper started publishing, when from May of 1920, for the next 91 weeks, there were articles in the weekly paper against people who were Jewish, accusing them of many different things. And I'm not going to go into detail about that, that they were responsible for this and that, this event and that, and they were in this industry and things were bad and they were taking over Hollywood, whatever you could think of. Eventually what he did is he took those 91 weeks of articles and he bound them into 4 volumes and he called it The Independent Jew. There were several lawsuits that were filed against him. Also, too, it was well known, it's not anything hidden, that Adolf Hitler became an admirer of Henry Ford's writings. And it said that one of the pictures in Adolf Hitler's office area, whatever, was of Henry Ford. One of the lawsuits was successful. It was in 1925, and it was because of something that they had written in the paper. And the paper ended, he had to issue an apology, and I find it really interesting that he said in his apology that he was greatly shocked with the articles in the publication that he funded because he was too busy to read it. I don't know. Earlier this year, this came to light even more. I don't know if you read about this or not. The Dearborn Historical Society has a publication called the Dearborn Historian. And in autumn of 2018, the editor, Bill McGraw, I think it's Bill McGraw, decided to write an article about Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent. What was interesting was that the mayor of Dearborn decided that he didn't want that going out. And they had already printed the magazine. The magazine was supposed to go out to about 230 of their subscribers, of their members that would get this. And he ordered that it be sent back to the printer and it not be sent out, because according to the mayor, he felt that Dearborn, for as many years as it was known as a segregated city, especially under Mayor Hubbard, who was the mayor of Dearborn for many, many years, that it had become more of an inclusive city, because it's 30 to 40% Arab American, and there's African Americans that are living in there. And he didn't want it going out. He also fired the editor of the magazine too. There was quite an uproar. Ironically, the thing that happened was that if he was trying to not have those people read it, actually a lot more people read it because the article went online. And you can still find it on the Bridge magazine and also Deadline Detroit. They have the article. And you know, everybody knows you've got to confront history that is uncomfortable. And as I said, with something like this, it was well known about this. For years, people would know about it. The thing that gets concerning, as I've been reading about it, are because of the rise of anti-Semitism that's been going on lately, people will still quote Henry Ford, which, you know, unfortunately. So you've got some good things about him, and this right here, who still sits there. The company, for years after Henry Ford, after the new administration came in with Henry Ford after the 1940s, and actually even before 1940s, have tried very, very hard to deal with this legacy in supporting Israel or other groups on this. But I think it's still going to be something that they're going to be dealing with for a while. A couple other things about Henry Ford, and that is one of the things that he created in 1926 was the 5-day work week. It happened in September. Ford went to 5 days, so you got Saturday off, not only Sunday but Saturday. This quote was from Henry Ford, and I thought this was really interesting, especially they'll become expert in the effective use of leisure. Just like with anything, Ford had a reason for doing this. And that is, if you give them a day off, it's going to increase consumption. And whether or not they're going to want to buy food or goods or a car, it's going to increase sales. That's what he hoped. I'm not quite sure if they ever did any statistics as far as how many more Fords sold as a result of the 5-day week, either before or after that. But that's something that Henry Ford was the first to do it, and a lot of companies followed suit. So here we have a photograph of Henry Ford looking at the original quadricycle to his left, and on the right they have the 10 millionth Model T. So the car first comes out in 1908, and 19 years later, 15 million sold. But there's a problem with the Ford. It's too good. It doesn't fall apart for the most part. And so when you look at what was beginning to happen, actually what began to happen even before 1927 is sales began to decline of the Model T because there were other options out there for people. The other thing is more people, now we were in the 1920s, more people were buying cars on the installment plan. And as a result, having a cheap, inexpensive Model T was not really all that important. The price of the car was not all important because they were going to have means of being able to buy their cars, buy other cars, maybe buy more luxurious cars than what the Model T might be able to give you. So with market taste changing, people were tired of black cars, although remember the Model T, the first color you always had was black, and they were willing to pay more. So by 1920, Ford had 50% of the market. By 1926, it was down to 33%. Now he tried by introducing another car. This was the Model A. They basically shut down production, and over here on the right-hand side, you see the Model A, which came out in 1927. But by that time, Ford had lost dominance. They were no longer number one. They became number two, and they were number two for a very, very long time. So, who became number one? Well, when you talk about what company overtook Ford Motor, there's a person you need to look at, and that's him, William C. Durant. William Durant, when we did our list of individuals that were involved with the auto industry, one of the things I may have mentioned about him is I really considered him an outlier in the sense that he's not one whose father worked in a machine shop. He's not one that worked in the bicycle industry or in some of these related industries. His grandfather was a man named Henry Crapo, who had made a fortune in Flint in the lumber industry and also had served as governor of the state of Michigan. And Billy, as he was known, Billy Durant, he was born out east, and when his parents got divorced, his mother brought the kids back to Flint to live with her father. Even at a young age, Billy Durant was known as a natural-born salesman. He started at the age of 21, and when you look at the kinds of things that he sold, there's a lot of differences between selling cigars as opposed to insurance and patent medicine. But he was always very, very successful, and he was another one who I think was always looking for the next best thing. And the next best thing for him was this red cart. This was the Coldwater Road Cart Company, and he purchased the company for $1,500. And the cart was known for a very good suspension system. And again, he has talent for selling. He took it to a fair in Wisconsin, and he sold 600 of them without knowing how to make them. But he was just very good at that. He moved the company from Coldwater to Flint. Eventually, he had a gentleman that came to join him, and that was Josiah Dart. And in the photograph, Josiah Dart is on the right, Billy Durant's on the left. And the statue that they have in Flint, you can see them standing right next to each other like this. Josiah Dart was involved with management. Durant was in charge of sales and promotion. That's no surprise itself. And so the Durant Dort Carriage Company became one of Flint's big three carriage makers. They produced a number of carriages, and Durant begins to do what he is known for, and that is a variety of models. So as opposed to Henry Ford wanting to make one model, Durant is spreading out. He begins to start doing this when he's with the Carriage Company. They were already integrating the concept of different models, and if you look at this photograph here, these are some of the examples of the carriages and wagons that the Durant Dort Carriage Company was making in Flint. They had a number of models with all kinds of different types of appealing names for these carriages. They began to bring a lot of these they began to buy more carriage companies and bring them to Flint. And here we have a picture of the Durant Dort factory in Flint. Flint became known as the Vehicle City. Now, when you think Vehicle City, you think of cars. But that's not where it started with Flint. With Flint, it was buggies and carriages. And of course, Durant Dort was not the only company, but it was definitely the larger of the one. And to note Vehicle City, in 1905, the city of Flint began to put up these arches. And they had them up for about the next 14 years when they were removed because of traffic lights that were going up in the street. Well, in 2003, Flint decided to bring them back. And so here's a photograph of some of the newer arches that they've brought back. And by 2008, within 5 years, they had 11 arches up in Flint. So to, again, reinforce that. Well, how did Durant think about the automobile? Well, he really didn't think about it at this time. He detested them. He thought they were noisy, dangerous, unreliable, and a fad. And he felt that motor cars, and these are his words, are odorous and noisy and would ruin the carriage business. That's an understatement. So let's sort of leave Durant for just a second, and let's return to David Buick. David Buick had made a fortune in the plumbing business. He had had a number of patents, and by the time he sold his company, he sold it for like $100,000. Now that's back around the late 1890s. You can only imagine what that would have been worth today. So what does he want to do? Doesn't want to sit around and invest his money. He wants to get into the next best thing, and that's cars. So he was selling gasoline. Well, he was actually selling just gasoline engines on the side, but he decided to put it together. And around 1899, with a partner, decided to experiment with a car. And between 1899 and 1901, he formed 3 different companies to produce a car. And in 1901, came up with this car right here. Looks a little bit like that quadricycle that Henry Ford had. One of the things that it was known, his early cars were known for, he patented an overhead valve engine. So this company was formed, as you see, in 1903. And I don't know what it was with David Buick. I don't know if it was just, I'm sure he was a good businessman, but eventually it was purchased 2 years later in 1905. It was purchased by James Whiting. And he was involved with the Flint wagon works. And you could see that just in the let's see, he bought it actually in 1905, but even that, they were beginning to produce cars, but produce cars at a definitely slower rate. Because again, remember, think in 1904, you don't have an assembly line that's moving. So you're still assembling those cars one by one like what you do. Well, Billy decided to buy Buick. And he drove it, liked it. Why, I don't know, because remember he had some really apprehensions about cars, but took it to, again, here we go again. So he bought the company, took the car to the New York Auto Show, and he sold 1,100 cars before they had even started production. Like I said, he was just a natural-born salesman. One of the reasons why I have read that it sold so well was because of that engine. That overhead valve engine. And I know that there are probably some of you out there who probably know a lot more about this than I do, so I'm not even going to try to even go any further about it at that point in time. So he reorganized the company, and they had a factory in Jackson, probably that, I don't know what kind of carriage production they did down there, but eventually he moved the Buick Car Company to Flint and created a complex of buildings, probably that had offices and factories. They had about 10 different buildings. And these buildings were doing things like making the bodies, the springs, the wheels, the castings. This is a postcard, probably around that same time. So whereas in 1904, Buick had made 16 cars, by 1908, they were making over 8,000. And it was number 1. Now keep in mind, 1908, the Model T hasn't come out quite yet. So you've got some competition, but the Buick at this point in time, now being number 1, might be a very fleeting position. You don't want to bank on it and create hats that say we're number 1, because by the time you do that, you might be way down on the list because the way that things were happening. But it did become number 1 in the nation. It was at this time, around 1908, that Durant formed a partnership with this guy. This is Louis Chevrolet, not to make cars, but to race. Henry Ford was also big on racing. I think we had a photograph earlier where his racing car driver was Barney Oldfield. And usually during these races, it would give these automakers a chance to try out new engines to see how they would operate. So Lewis Chevrolet was racing for Billy Durant, and they had quite a team. Now, as far as what happened to David Buick, this was, I think, a little sad, but maybe he was okay with it. He sold his last shares to a Buick to Durant 2 years before. They were making about 8,000 cars very quickly. He got involved with other ventures, but when he passed away in 1929, his entire fortune was gone. And that's what I think is a little poignant there about that. There were other people that Durant brought to Flint for the Buick Company. Charles Stewart Mott. Now, if you're familiar with Flint, that name might ring a bell because there's quite a very large foundation, the C.S. Mott Foundation, that's located in Flint. Well, at this time, Mott was, he owned an axle factory from Utica, New York, and Durant had convinced him to come to Flint and said that he would have the exclusive contract with Buick, which he did. He continued with the company. He had sold the business to Durant. He held stock. He eventually was on the board. And then, of course, as I said, the Mott Foundation, and he really did become a permanent part of Flint. So C.S. Mott. Benjamin Brisco. Now, Benjamin Brisco was not involved with Durant. Benjamin Brisco was involved with auto production. And Brisco had originally made parts, and then he was making cars himself. But he did have this idea around 1908. And what his idea was to try to merge some of these auto companies together that were all making medium-priced automobiles. Not the real luxurious cars like the Cadillacs, but the real inexpensive, the low-priced ones here. And so he looked at it. He had talked to people. He had had lunch with Henry Ford. Henry Ford had actually said he would agree to sell the company, but he wanted $8 million in cash, which he did not get. And I think this may have been a time that Brisco was talking to him right about at the beginning of the Model T, and I don't know if Ford actually knew what the success of the Model T was going to be. He also talked to Ransom Olds, and at this time in 1908, Ransom Olds was with his second company, REO, located in Lansing. Olds said he wanted stock, and he didn't get that. No, he wanted cash. He wanted cash. Ransom Olds wanted cash, not stock. But the person who really latched on to this idea, to Benjamin Brisco's idea, was, of course, Durant. So Durant began to acquire different companies. He bought the Olds Motor Works for $3 million. That was Ransom Olds' first car company, and he had sold it and moved on. So Durant bought that one. He was looking for a title of this company. He was going to call it United Motor Car Company or International Motor Car Company. That didn't make any sense there. And so he filed papers for this name of this company, General Motors, in September of 1908. Keep in mind, though, this is totally different from Ford because what General Motors started out with was a holding company. And when you look at the companies that the car companies that he had already under his umbrella, of course, he had Buick. He already had Oldsmobile, Oakland Car Company, and then Cadillac. What happened with Cadillac was Henry Leland, who had started Cadillac, sold Cadillac to Billy Durant. He actually worked for GM for a very short time, and then the thing that Henry Leland did, there seems to be a repetition with so many of these individuals where they get involved with the car company, they get out of one car company, and then they try to get into another one, or they try to start another one car company. And with Henry Leland, after he left Cadillac, what was interesting was that he started in 1917 another car company called Lincoln. And the reason why he called it Lincoln is because when you look at when he was born, because he was born in 1843, the first president he voted for was Abraham Lincoln. And so that's where that gets its name. And then eventually he sold Lincoln to Ford. So Cadillac. The other thing that Durant does, though, is he continues to buy more companies. He continues to buy more car companies that made cars like the Ewing, the Marquette, the Welch, the Scripps Booth, the Sheridan, the Elmore, the Rapid and Reliance, going on and on and on and on. He also brings in more part companies. So Elbert Champion, who started the AC Spark Plug Company, comes to Flint. He also purchased the Seeger Engine Works. So when we look now at the difference between what was going on with Henry Ford and Billy Durant, it was a totally different way of approaching automobiles, as opposed to Ford, Model T, that's it. If you don't like the Model T, forget it. You can go try to find something else. And Durant, whose company now is having all these different models of cars and all these different companies. So totally, totally different. But there's a concern, and that is with the bankers. So within 2 years of Durant creating this company, you can see here that the bankers are definitely concerned about what is happening with this place. What happens is, as you see here, they don't have enough money to pay their bills, and they loaned him, well, actually, the group of bankers loaned him $12 million for stock notes, and actually, I think they gave the money to the company that was contingent, the $12 million was contingent upon Durant leaving the company. And so the bankers felt that the price that Durant had paid for the companies was too much. He was stripped of operating power, liquidated numerous, what the bank did was liquidate numerous unprofitable operations. And Charles Nash, so you've got Billy Durant in that upper right-hand corner. And this is a photo you see a lot with Billy Durant. He's got that smile on his face and that cap that's sort of at a great angle, plus plaid. You know, plaid is just really great. So this is Billy Durant. This is Charles Nash. Now, Charles Nash was working for Billy Durant, and they brought him in to become president of the company. And he had been head of the Buick division. He had actually worked for Durant during the Carriage Company days and then worked his way up. So he now becomes president of General Motors. So what does Durant do? Does he sit back, maybe create another, I don't know, sit back on his, whatever, as, just sit around and act like he's retired? So what does he do? He creates another car company. With his good buddy, Louis Chevrolet, they created this company, and it became known for a low-priced vehicle. And I think in this photo here, you've got Louis Chevrolet in the car, and here you've got Billy Durant right here. Pretty sure that's Billy Durant right there. So even though it was more expensive than a Model T, it was known to be a lot more comfortable than the Model T and had a little more refinements than what you would find there. So now what is Durant doing with the money that he's making from Chevrolet? Well, he's buying GM stock. And he's acquiring more GM stock. So he leaves the company in 1910, creates Chevrolet in 1911, and what happens is, look what happens by 1916. He's back. He owns a majority stake in General Motors, and so he's back in the company. And he's aided by this gentleman right here, Pierre DuPont from New York, who's a banker. So he's helping them. And so then they merge Chevrolet into the company 2 years later. So Durant is back heading General Motors. As far as what happens to some of the people who leave after that, well, as far as Charles Nash goes, Charles Nash leaves after Durant comes back, and he creates his own company, the Nash Car Company. And I don't know if any of you remember AMC, the American Motor Corporation. Nash was one of the cornerstones of AMC when that was formed. Another individual, Walter Chrysler, who's standing right here, Walter Chrysler had been hired by Nash to be in charge of Buick. So when Nash moved up to be president of General Motors, Chrysler came in as president of Buick. And he left GM by 1919, and the thing that he did was, with the money he got for his General Motors stock, he got about $10 million, he purchased the Maxwell Motor Works, which he renamed Chrysler, and eventually he purchased Dodge in 1928. And so he's on his way with his company. Well, what happens with General Motors after Durant comes into charge again in 1916? Look at how big it gets. 8 times larger than what it had been before. There's more companies that come in, more parts companies that come in, Fisher Body, Delco, and GMAC. They now have their own financing arm at General Motors. GMAC stands for General Motors Acceptance Corporation. So that's one thing that Ford doesn't have. They have that right there. As far as some of these companies that came in, they also brought in some very talented individuals. Like this gentleman over here, Charles Kettering, over on the left-hand side of the photo, which Charles Kettering came in with Delco, which stands for the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company. And Kettering is known for the electric starter. He also was the head of research for General Motors for over 20 years. And this group of gentlemen right here, the person I'd like to point out is this gentleman right here on the left-hand side. That's Alfred Sloan. And Alfred Sloan had come in with the Hyatt Roller Bearing Company and became very key to General Motors later on. Another thing that happened at this time period between 1916 and 1920 is Durant decides to have a massive building built as the headquarters for General Motors. And so the General Motors building, which was designed by Albert Kahn, it was originally called the Durant Building. And there were shields around the building with the letter D on them. In fact, I think they were around in this area of the building. It was massive. It was finally completed in 1923. It's on Grand Avenue in downtown Detroit, not across from Fisher, but if you're at this building, if you just go a little bit further, you're by the Fisher building. So it's around in that area on Grand Avenue. It was headquarters for General Motors until 2000 when they moved to the Renaissance Center. And currently right now it holds offices for the state of Michigan. Just a massive, massive building. Well, let's talk about what happened with Billy Durant, because it happened again. I think this gentleman had more lives than a cat, frankly. So here we've got Pierre DuPont again in this slide. And they are very concerned when you have a company that within 4 years has grown to 8 times its size. And the company was, as you can see here, on the verge of bankruptcy. This was around 1919, 1920. Right after World War I, we had a very serious economic depression and a downslide. There was a panic. And between 1919 and 1920, the value of General Motors stock went from $42 to $14. Billy Durant lost $90 million himself at that time period with the drop of the stock. So he was forced out, but was he done yet in the automobile industry? No. This is a photograph, a much later photograph, that shows, here's Billy Durant here, here's Alfred Sloan here on the right-hand side. Billy Durant passed away in 1947, so this must have been not long before that. But he did form his own car company, which existed throughout the 1920s and finally went out of business by 1929, 1930. And definitely he overextended himself. So he lost $90 million, okay, by 1920. By 1939, he lost $120 million. So within a 10-year time period, he lost $210 million. Unbelievable. He did file for bankruptcy, and what was interesting was that after World War II, he felt that bowling alleys were going to be the next big thing. I don't think anything went at that point in time. General Motors, for some time, really didn't embrace Billy Durant. And I think it was later on, I mean, you can see here, Alfred Sloan standing next to him, that I don't want to say that there was a reconciliation, but a thing, I think more of a realization that he was certainly part of their past and was included in things. Okay, so what happened to General Motors after Durant departed? That's where this gentleman came in. So Mr. Sloan, who had originally come in with his company, the Hyatt roller ball bearing company, but after Durant left, he became the CEO for the next 23 years. He became chair of the board for the 10 years after that. What he did was definitely reorganize the company. And what he decided to do was to get rid of a lot of those car companies that had already, the ones that had not been merged out, gotten out, and decided to only focus on 5 lines. The Oakland Car Company, yes, was making Pontiac cars. Oakland Car Company had started in Pontiac, so it made sense for that. So what they decided to do was just look at those 5 different divisions. And what they did was, with those 5 different divisions, is what they wanted it to do was to market these lines for different people. And you would have something that is referred to as the status ladder, where you would start off and then work your way up. So for example, I always like to say, and when I say the bottom of the ladder, I'm being very, very respectful, because I grew up with Chevrolets. So you had Chevrolets, and then of course the top of the ladder would be the Cadillac. And then again, my guess is, I've never really seen it laid out, but I would say Chevrolet, I would think Pontiac, but I always get mixed up with Buick and Oldsmobile as far as which one would be next. If Oldsmobile would be 3, and then Buick would be 4. Okay, and then Cadillac would be 5. So you had this status ladder. In some cases, you stayed at that certain level. With my parents, they stayed at Chevrolet until the kids were out of the house. And then they could make their way up to Pontiac, and eventually I think they got a Buick, never a Cadillac. We had other members of the family that decided to jump from Chevrolet to Cadillac, but not going to figure out why they did that. So they're targeting those to a certain economic level. And what they want you to do, of course, is they want you to think about, what you're going to be driving. And so that's the one thing when they're branding these cars, and how successful you are if you move up, if you're going to move up on that status ladder. The other thing that General Motors did was the whole idea of the new models. I remember that quite vividly, but I can remember it happening in September when the new models would come out. Because what happens is when somebody runs into your car and your father has to go get a new car and it's around the summer and the only thing they have on the lot is a battleship gray car, they get a battleship gray car, and you keep wishing that they would have waited until September to get something a little more lively than a battleship gray car. But that's what your family drove for a long time. But they did create this whole idea of models, and they created the concept of what's called, we talk about variety marketing and status ladder. The status ladder, as far as the idea of upgrading. And I guess too, what you're finding there is then what you do is you're part of the GM family. You're not thinking about, I'm going to go to a Ford. They want you to stay within that GM family and then try to move your way up if that's what you want to do. And that's something different than what they had ever done before. I mean, they had gotten rid of all those other companies and just concentrated on those 5 ideas. So the concept of changing models, and the idea of the changing models, yes, different styling, different features. It may not be anything great, but it was enough of a difference that you could tell. And the advertising, if you remember, was major about wanting you to get that new model because of what it might have. What's ironical when you think about it is how that was adopted by other industries. I'm not saying that Sloan and GM were the first ones that created this, but it certainly seems to be when you think about the 1920s and you have this whole thing when you look at appliances and televisions and computers and cell phones. This whole idea of coming out with new models and putting something in there that you know you need to have because it's definitely going to be an improvement. Henry Ford did not want to accept this. He wanted to stick to the way that he was selling cars. He wanted to stick to the way that he was producing cars. And as a result, Ford declined. As we said, they went down to 2, and they stayed at 2 for a long time. Meanwhile, General Motors is getting larger and larger and larger and becomes one of the largest industrial companies in the world. He remained in second place probably for many, many years. Now, there was definitely a management change when his grandson, Henry Ford II, took over the company. But for a long time, there would be no change with Henry Ford, and they would continue with that. We're going to be continuing to touch on the car industry throughout this part and the next part in November when it comes to auto production, because as I said in May, you have an industry now that becomes the dominant industry in the state of Michigan. So it's natural that we're going to touch upon it before. We're just getting away from automobiles itself, but one of the things you look at too is the growth of what I call other companies that are producing parts that these companies need. And when you look at, even by 1917, the numbers of companies and the number of part firms, and these are scattered throughout the state, not just located in the Detroit area, because we do have transportation that's going to get stuff to where it's got to go. Now, there were communities, there were cities, Grand Rapids, of course, Kalamazoo, that were also making cars, but it was not a dominant industry like what it was in what I like to call, and what I actually not myself, but in what you're reading, the Triangle, which is Detroit, Lansing, Flint, as far as auto production there. Well, the same time that you're producing these cars, you're also producing a major need to improve the roads. And when you're looking at roads, we got to go back to this gentleman, Horatio Earl, who I covered when we looked at the progressive era, because when you're looking at the progressive era at this time, you need good roads because it was considered to be necessary to help farmers get their goods to where they have to go. And this is the man that really spearheaded this, Horatio Earl. Horatio Earl was a bicyclist. He was a member of the League of American Wheelmen. And actually, it was the bicyclists that really pushed for good roads at the end of the 19th century. Now, it wasn't primarily because they wanted to ride their bikes on better roads. And as I said, does that sound familiar? But also, too, they were thinking about the other people that use the roads, specifically farmers. They needed to do that. So he was actually a farm tool salesman, and he started a cycle company. And the League of American Wheelmen, where he was a member, lobbied for bike paths along public highways, also the right to carry bikes on railroad cars. And I don't know how you reach this. They lobbied for equal rights with horse-drawn vehicles. Not sure quite what that meant. I haven't had any kind of explanation. But, big thing was how to improve the roads. Now, the thing with Earl is he became involved with politics. He was a member of the Michigan Highway Improvement Commission, and he was also a state senator. And he did create in 1901 and 1902 what was called the Good Roads Train. And it was a series of vehicles that would travel from city to city in Michigan to promote better roads. In 1902, he was on the road for 14 weeks, going from town to town. One of the things it resulted in was this constitutional amendment in 1905 to the Constitution, the second Constitution. And what it allowed Michigan to pay for roads. And from 1850 to 1905, the state was not able to fund any internal improvements. But in 1905, that changed. The Department of Transportation, the Michigan Department of Transportation, or MDOT, began in 1905. So that's what they use as their beginning date. When we look at roads, there's a couple different things that happened after that. Our third Constitution, one of the things that it had there was to allow the state to build the roads. So 3 years earlier, they could fund the roads, but now they could actually build the roads themselves. The Federal Aid Road Act, here you get the federal government involved, and it's the first time this is happening. The United States is going to spend $75 million over 5 years, matched with state money, and it was the beginning of national financing for roads at that time in 1916. So, because we have to raise money, more money, there was an amendment to that Constitution that raised $50 million in the state of Michigan so we could get roads improved. And 2 years later, you have another federal act, and what that does is it begins to create the network of highways that we have. Not the highways we know, but the highways earlier, back then in the 1920s. And you've got federal aid for that. So within a 13-year time span, you're seeing the framework that goes into the money that they need for roads. This begins probably in Michigan, where now we're dealing with a lot of debate right now on how to fund roads, but it starts now this continual conversation, debate, whatever you might want to say, where the funding of roads becomes like the first or second, probably let's say the top 5, within the top 5 of expenses that the state incurs is continuing. And it's of course, as we see right now, an issue that is still debatable about how do you fund the roads and improving the roads. This is something that they were dealing with back then. And a lot of that because of the bicyclists, but because of the demand with these cars. The Model T may have been able to withstand it, but not all cars were going to be able to withstand it. They were going to need better roads. Okay. Well, we're going to leave automobiles for the time being and get into at least a couple other topics before we leave this evening. And that is World War I. Because while all of this is going on, we do have some things that are certainly worldwide events that are bringing the United States in and obviously impact Michigan in a lot of different ways. So the war in Europe began in 1914. Of course, we were not involved militarily, but we knew what was going on through newspapers, through speakers. There were Chautauquas that were going on. Henry Ford made an attempt in December of 1915 to go on the peace ship. That lasted very, very short. But when war was declared in Michigan, there were a lot of things that happened. There was a board that had already been created to see what was necessary. The state was deciding on how much money that they were going to raise for this. The governor was given broad powers to raise $5 million and disperse it in whichever way that they wanted to. As far as the forces, you've got 2 divisions. And within those divisions, you had a total of about 175,000 men that served in those 2 divisions. The 32nd, which was known as the Red Arrow, and the 126th Infantry Division within the Red Arrow was led by this gentleman in the lower right-hand corner, and that's Joseph Westnich from Kalamazoo. Or I should say Colonel Joe. Colonel Joe Westnich, who grew up in Kalamazoo. His family's farm was located where the Candlewick Apartments are on South Burdick and Kilgore. And actually had a brother, Richard, who had been in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurrection, who unfortunately had passed away. Also had 2 sisters. And his parent, at least his mother, was still living at that point in time. Well, what are some of the things, when I look at, same thing with the Civil War, when I'm looking at a national, and in this case, an international event in Michigan, what is the approach that I always want to take? And that is to look at what was going on in Michigan at the time. And actually, this is another photograph we have in our collection at the archives at Western of units that are over in Europe. I wish I could tell you which one this was, and I've got it back at the archives. I'm not sure exactly which one. One of the things that happened in Michigan is we see the creation of new military bases. The gentleman's picture over in the right-hand corner is Henry Joy. And Henry Joy had started the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit, and he also created the state's first airport. And you can see it was in Macomb County. And actually, the Packard Experimental Department had used the area because they were developing what they did is create a motor, an aviation motor. He had originally purchased the area, a group of farms, in 1915. He had 640 acres, and the government took it over and, as you see here, renamed it to Selfridge Field. They built a new road to get to it, which they called Henry Joy Boulevard. The air base was named after Thomas Selfridge, who was a Signal Corps aviator who died in 1908. They had a school for mechanics and aerial gunnery. Albert Kahn had designed the building. You can see the federal government took it over about 4 years after they took over operations, and it still is a base for the National Guard. It is the second oldest military airfield in continuous operation, so Selfridge Field. Another base that was created was Camp Custer. Camp Custer that was located to the west of Battle Creek. They offered quite a number of acres for this. And it opened in September of 1917, as you see here. And think about the impact that this had, not only in Battle Creek, but also in Kalamazoo. There are many, many postcard views of Camp Custer. There were over, as you see there were over 3,000 buildings that were created on the grounds. Here's another postcard that we have in our collection. Over in the corner, it says Army YMCA class and French officers, 339th Infantry, 85th Division, Camp Custer. And these are just a few of them from Camp Custer. Another thing from this era is that there are a lot of photographs that exist of soldiers, either with, and the one on the left, with their wife, or single photographs of them during the war. As far as the home front goes, Barthy home front, the state allocated funds to improve roads, give aid to farmers so you could increase your crops because the soldiers were going to need to eat. They would aid the farmers for food production. The state purchased tractors at cost and sold to farmers, and they actually encouraged people to volunteer on farms. There was no mandated rationing or voluntary. It was voluntary, the wheatless, meatless, heatless days. But one of the things that was created at this time was the Michigan State Constabulary. They were also known as the Michigan Cavalry. They were created in April of 1917. They were given the task of guarding railroad yards and waterfront, and they later became known as the Michigan State Police. So they traced their beginnings to about this time period. Their first headquarters was on land loaned by the Michigan Agricultural College, or MSU. And eventually, in fact, just recently, they moved their headquarters from there to downtown Lansing. So they're no longer in East Lansing near MSU. They also guarded munition plants, mines, railroad tunnels, warehouses, grain elevators, shipping docks. They brought in draft dodgers. And eventually, once the war was over and once Prohibition started, they were involved with the enforcement of Prohibition. That's one of the things that they did. Okay, so we already talked about what happened on the home front as far as food production with farming. I mean, we may not have had the level of farming that we did in the Civil War, but we still had a number of farmers here in the area. There was a big push for people buying Liberty bonds, and you saw a growth of the number of organizations that had either started or grew. Like, for example, the American Red Cross, which in Kalamazoo had already started but really grew because of World War I, Salvation Army, and the YMCA. As far as what's going on at other places like universities and colleges, this is a photograph that is Western. And this is a group of students that are drilling down below the hill around Davis Street. I don't quite know. I think this is around 1918. Some men went into the military. About 50 of Western students joined Colonel Joe. Eventually at Western, about 418 students, graduates, and faculty joined the military. Western had the Student Army Training Corps. It was formed September of 1918, and that's who we're seeing in this photograph here. And they were 370 military trainees, and they lived in barracks. They studied military science, and they studied regular college courses. They drilled. They also participated in campus activities, and it was said that Dwight Waldo, the president of Western State Teachers College, was happy to see the men because he had lost most of his football team. And at least he was assured of some football players here that were members of the Student Army Training Corps. This was disbanded when the war ended. This next photograph is Kalamazoo College. And this is their Student Army Training Corps. Okay. I have not figured out where this is taken. I don't know if it's in that area below at the end of Academy Street, but these are students from Kalamazoo College. As far as what was going on in industry, now there was not total conversion. Now what do I mean by that? They were still making automobiles for people, as opposed to World War II when civilian automobile production ceased altogether. So, but it did go into high gear because with all these companies now that were making automobiles, it would be very easy for them to merge and start making things for war production. So you have a number of contracts that are given out to companies. For example, Ford. This is where they really moved out to River Rouge because, excuse me, because of the availability of the river and transportation. And this is what they mainly built. The trucks, the whippet tanks, the ambulances. This was really the first, as I said, the first mechanized war that we know of, or I should say the first motorized war. And the original contract was for about 112 submarine chasers. They ended up making 60. Here is an early photograph of the Rouge plant, and they needed it for war products, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I said that they had received federal support, dredged the Rouge River. The first building was 350 feet wide, 100 feet high, and it spanned over 10 acres. They moved the assembly line on flat cars on railroad tracks pulled by tractors, and there were over 8,000 workers that worked on the war contracts at Rouge. As far as some of the other auto companies, you can see a list here of some of the contracts they got. So definitely a lot of motor-related things that they were doing. Although you've got, at the bottom, you can see in some of the cities, Ecorse, Saginaw, that are on the water, that they were building ships for the war effort. One of the things that we deal with World War I is the idea of propaganda and discrimination. I have a photo here. It's a more recent photo than World War I. This is the AUV Hall, which was located on Portage Road. For the most part, it was on the east side, just past Michigan Avenue, until 1980, when the tornado hit it and took most of it down. The AUV, we had a number of Germans living in Kalamazoo, and the AUV Hall had started in 1869. It was in a different building until they built this one in the 1890s. And when it started, it was a social hall for people, a place where they had meetings and gathered, and they also had support for some of the workers. But at this time, during World War I, there was a big level of discrimination against people who were German and German descent, and some of the institutions like the AUV Hall closed. We also had an indoor gym that was located on North Burdick Street, and that closed at that time. There were about 100,000 German Americans living in Michigan at that time, because in the early 19th century, Germans were highly recruited. There was food renamed. You've heard of that before. Sauerkraut became Frankfurter, or Frankfurters became hot dogs. There were German businesses that closed in Kalamazoo. There was one on East Michigan, the Dessenberg wholesale grocery firm, that closed. So there was other episodes of more violence, book burnings, people who were beaten because of their German ancestry at this time. Okay. Another part of Michigan history, especially during World War I, that you see more and more written about these days, and that's the polar bears, the polar bear expeditions. And this is one of the photographs that we have of the polar bear expeditions. The thing about the polar bears is that these are soldiers, majority of them from Michigan, who were sent to Russia. They were sent several months before there was an armistice. But they were there to fight the Bolsheviks. They were joined by forces from Great Britain, France, and Canada. And many of them didn't know that they were going to Russia. They thought they were going somewhere else. About 90% of the soldiers were from Michigan. And they fought the Bolsheviks. The Allies were concerned when Russia signed a treaty with Germany, so they were concerned about it, and that's why they were sending soldiers over there to fight. They were located not far from the Arctic Circle. American soldiers did come home. A total of 245 Americans died. About 305 were wounded or sick. And what you see down here in the lower right-hand corner is a memorial that you can find at a cemetery in Troy, Michigan, about the polar bears. And recently there have been a couple books about polar bears. There's been a most recent one that talks about the polar bear expedition and what it was like. Well, in the beginning of 1918, I decided to do a display case on World War I because of it. 2018 coinciding with the armistice 100 years earlier. And it was a really interesting experience for me because it was a really great way of getting to know the collection. I knew that we had a lot of letters in the collection. I knew we had some photos, but I was really able to stretch myself and find some very interesting things. Yes, books that you see up here at the top shelf. We had some really nice posters from the era about selling savings bonds. You've already seen some of these photographs already. The thing that was a real pleasure for me was in the category of what we in archives call ephemera, which were things that were produced not to be saved. They were produced like for what was considered to be temporary in nature. And we do have some photographs, like when you talk about, we have a number of collections from some of the men who fought in the polar bear expeditions. And so we have like this scrapbook of photographs from it, snapshots, absolutely fascinating. Postcards from Russia, and then also all these different things like a menu written in English and Russian. Also a price list in American dollars and rubles for things. Newspapers that were created at the time. And we have like notebooks that, like a diary that someone would write or a journal someone would write about being in Russia at that time. Just absolutely fascinating in putting this thing together. And it took me quite a bit of time to pull it, but it was a real pleasure to get to know what this was all about. Now, the other thing that I had in this case, I had Some pieces from, because we have the collections, the early years from the Kalamazoo chapter of the American Red Cross right here. And up here, you really can't see it all that well, but the photograph I have up there is an institution that really got started because of World War I indirectly, and that is Douglas Community Association. And the Douglas Community Association recently celebrated its centennial. The Douglas Community Association originally got started because when the soldiers would get leave, they would either go to Battle Creek from Camp Custer, they'd either go to Battle Creek or they'd come to Kalamazoo. And when they came to Kalamazoo, there was really no place for the African American soldiers to go. So the Douglas Community Association originally began to provide soldiers, African American soldiers, a place to go when they were on leave. This photograph was taken later when the organization formally organized in 1919, and their early meeting areas were in a building on North Burdick at about the intersection of Eleanor Street. And in fact, coincidentally, it had been site of that German gymnasium called Turnverein, and that became the first site of the Douglas Community Association before it moved on. So we have at least one great organization that dates from that time period. Well, I think I'm going to end at that point. When we come back in November, we are going to start with the Roaring '20s. And we're going to talk about the Roaring '20s. We're going to go into the '30s and talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal, and then also get into World War II. So those are the topics that we're going to cover in the November class. A couple things that I wanted to bring to your attention, and that is going back to the automobile industry. It should be no surprise the number of books that are out there that deal with the automobile industry in Michigan. I just brought a couple from my collection, but one of them that I haven't read yet, but I'm really going to, I'm sure that you're all familiar with the author Upton Sinclair. And what I knew Upton Sinclair from, of course, was from The Jungle, the very critical look at the meat packing industry in Chicago. What I didn't know is he also wrote a book that was not very flattering towards Henry Ford. And he wrote a very short book called The Flivver King. And it was the story of Ford America by Upton Sinclair. It never ceases to amaze me how many books keep coming out about the automobile industry. There always seems to be another biography of Henry Ford that happens. The one that recently was published was not so much about his production line, but about the story of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison's 10-year road trip. They had quite a friendship, and they would go camping with Harvey Firestone, and it's called The Vagabonds. It's amazing what you can find at Costco. I do love the Friends bookstore so much, and I found this one this year. It's called Are We There Yet? The American Automobile, Past, Present, and Driverless. So they still keep coming. They still keep coming. All right, anybody have any questions or comments at this point? Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, can you tell me about how Michigan or the Kalamazoo area was affected by the influenza pandemic? Or anything interesting you know about
the influenza? I can't tell you specifically, but Sharon Ferraro has done research on it for years and is hoping to put her research together in a publication. She literally went through every death certificate from anybody that you could find about it. Yes, we had it. I can't tell you what the death rates were. I do know that the Stockbridge Everhard home on South Street was at one time used as a hospital for patients from the flu. She did find that there were students from Western who passed away. So I don't like, my interest in is, I am interested obviously in the flu. I'm also interested in tuberculosis. But it's incredible what Sharon has done. And I don't know, Beth, if Sharon gave a presentation, Beth, did Sharon give a presentation on TB, or not TB, but influenza here? At the museum, yeah. Is there a video of that? Not the museum, unfortunately. They don't videotape their programs. But if you don't know Sharon, Sharon is the Historic Preservation Coordinator for the City of Kalamazoo. And you could contact her, and she could hook you up to any information. If you just either go on the City of Kalamazoo website and type in her name, she can, Sharon Ferraro, and I'm sure she'd be more than happy to give you whatever information that you would like about it. Anybody else have any questions? Yes?
Just a comment that we've just finished reading for book group, the Lewis Babe's Arsenal of Democracy.
Okay.
And it's about the gear up of the Ford plant at Willow Run for producing all the bombers.
Yes, in World War II.
World War II.
Yeah.
But there's quite a bit of background about the Ford family and the rise of the automobile industry and all of the other people involved.
Mm-hmm.
The Ford, the interrelationships between Henry and Edsel, and more on the anti-Semitism too, and his racial dealings, and it's just very well tied together.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I've got that book, but I didn't know that they would have brought all of that in, which is good.
He did it as background
Okay.
for the hows and whys and what it took to gear up.
Mm-hmm. I think that there had been attempts, especially with Edsel, to have him step down and have Edsel take over, which didn't work, and he still maintained control over the company for a while on that. I'll have to look at that book on my shelf. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Beth already mentioned that I will be back here in November, where we will continue this, and I hope you'll be able to join me then. So thank you very much.